in one of your other papers in 2015, Bodies of Lenin. So Mitya,
hi, thanks. Hi, everyone. Alexei, здравствуйте. Приятно познакомиться. Thanks for asking, because it's a real honor to say a few words about Alexei's work. I'm not gonna be long. I just want to quickly summarize probably the best known book by Alexei Yurchak, which is Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, because and offered some a personal reflection, if you like, because I really think that it's one of the it's the book of a kind. The kind of book that really helps you to orient in history, if you like. At least that was my impression when I read it, because I immediately realized what my parents were actually talking about when they were talking about normal life in the late Soviet Union. So for those in the group who are unfamiliar, I'm just gonna offer a rapid summary of the book without really doing justice to the complexity of the argument, which in this case is really necessary because it attempts to explain a very complex phenomena. But basically, if I were to do a really quick, rapid summary, I think one of the and this book I should say is very influential, not just in in sort of academic discussion, but also I think a lot of people beyond academia, or a considerable number of people beyond academia, actually read it here in Russia, and it was debated in rather widely, I would say, for an academic title. And I think it's because it really does help you to understand things. So and the reason why it was so influential, I think, is that it actually offered a plausible explanation for why it is wrong to see the Soviet experience and the ideology in binary terms, basically saying that people who were part of it and sort of supported it were either cynical or in a sense stupid, just that they were deceived, they were under the spell of ideology. And so and this is a very important breakthrough, I think, in thinking about the complexity of the late Soviet period, because for many people who actually lived in that time, well, it indeed wasn't that simple. It wasn't like an either-or choice. And so to explain, to sort of show what a non-binary view could be, the book synthesizes a vast literature on performativity, which some people are clearly familiar with here, and basically argues that the Soviet discourse, the Soviet ideology, including not just discourse, but also ritualized acts like going to the elections, so basically the kind of official life that people were living. So this entire body of ideology became hyper-normalized, which is one of the concepts that became widely known, as Vasily noted in his email about Alexei's work. And so that hyper-normalization that occurred after Stalin's death, because this sort of official ideology was now lacking a meta external position from which it could be commented upon, corrected, interpreted, and it became some sort of autonomous engine, endlessly producing hyper-normalized statements and rituals. And that hyper-normalization actually created the conditions of possibility for what Alexei calls a performative shift, meaning a certain redistribution of the constitutive and performative functions of the speech acts, of rituals, of discourse, towards the performative, so that the the sort of social effects, if you like, of the rituals and of participation in the rituals, in ideological rituals, became more important than their literal content, even though that doesn't mean that they became empty. But on the contrary, this sort of hyper normalization and performative shift created the conditions for new meanings to emerge within this kind of old framework of ritualized statements and acts. And so that's how the Soviet Union basically fell. And this is, I think, obviously that's a very rapid and summary which doesn't do justice to the complexity of the argument, but I think it's a very intriguing argument. And it does actually explain why no one seemed to be surprised when the Soviet state actually fell. So it sort of locates one of the points in the chain of events that led to the fall of the Soviet Union in the symbolic sort of dimension. And so that's what the book is about. And the author today will talk about his more recent work, but I just wanted to emphasize for those who are unfamiliar with Alexei's work or with the sort of recent Russian history, that this sort of analytical lenses help to make sense of many otherwise hard to understand ambiguous cultural phenomena. And one of these, perhaps one of the most famous, is the famous television hoax about how Lenin was a mushroom. And Alexei has a paper devoted to that episode. I'm just gonna post the link to the chat, so those people who are interested can appreciate the the complexity of the of the phenomena that the book attempted to explain. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks very much, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Mitya. So Alexei, Mitya, you wanted to say something first, maybe. So Alexei, can we hear a little bit more about the context in which Lenin died in 1924?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Very exciting, and I don't quite know how to assess the diversity of the audience, which is probably a good thing. From what I understand, this is a very diverse forum. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. Like everyone else, I've been doing it on Zoom for a year, and sometimes the connection is not good. I wanted also to thank Dmitry for a very kind introduction of the book. And thank you, Nika and Vasily, for organizing it, and everyone for coming. I should probably say a little bit more than just the context in which Lenin died. As Vasily asked, I should probably explain to you why this strange, wacky paper appeared. Communist proteins. I recognize full well that it's a little wacky, but not in the good sense of the word. And I will have to explain to you that it's part of a larger project which I'm working on, actually finishing, and I'm hoping to finish soon, relatively soon, within months. It's a book project on Lenin's body for a shorthand, but it's actually about the lab, which biochemical and biological lab in Moscow, which has maintained that body and cultivated that body for almost a century. In 3 years, it will be a century. Lenin died in 1924. And when I started exploring that theme, first of all, everyone was saying it's impossible to find anything out because it's very close. It's extremely secretive. But of course, as we know when we do research, especially anthropologists with their field methods, nothing is as close that it may appear from the outside. And I started doing this research as a historian. In this particular case, I'm a historical anthropologist as well as maybe social anthropologist. In the archives in Moscow, a lot of the archives are open, some of them are not. And then eventually I worked in the archives in many different countries, in Czech Republic, in Bulgaria, in the United States, and in different archives in Russia, in Paris as well. But eventually I started doing an ethnographic part of the project. I found scientists who work in the lab, or who worked in the lab in the past. Some of them published something about it, and that's how I found them. Some of them, through the snowballing effect, they introduced me to other scientists. The main problem was for me to explain to them that I'm not trying to ridicule the project, which is the sort of the dominant mode in which one reads about Lenin's body, is a bit of an ironic sort of mode. As many things Russian one reads in the Western liberal media, it's ironic or very negative. And you know, you don't really go very far with that. So I started by saying, this is not my project. I want to actually undo that. I want to understand what happened, how it all emerged, what's the meaning of it, what other things emerged around it. So basically, it's a very complex thing, and I wanted to study it. And you know, not surprisingly, many scientists responded very positively to that impulse once they started trusting me. Of course, it took some time meeting with them in their apartments and cafes, and not in the lab itself. And then they eventually, every now and again, would bring me there when the director was not there. And so forth and so forth. I can talk about it more. But the point is that it's not quite a history, as Vasily said, but it's partly a history of Lenin's body, but partly it's also a kind of a science anthropology of what it means to preserve something which is not reducible to just a body of a concrete human being, which also stands for something bigger than a human being. And in fact, the fact that it stands bigger for something bigger than a human being is not something I discovered only in the way they talk about the body, or the way it was spoken about by the party during the Soviet times. That's one aspect of it. But also even in the kind of scientific practices and manipulations and research which are designed to address this body. So it is always Lenin's body and something which is not quite Lenin and bigger. It's this embodiment of a certain foundational truth, as I call it, which is very much connected to the concept which we know from social theory as sovereignty, the idea, the location of the sovereign center of power. Something which is kind of bracketed out, is external to the political field, something to which you refer as a foundational truth which you cannot question, but which you start from, and everything follows from it. And that's not something which is limited to a quote unquote frightening word, totalitarianism. It's not only limited to communist system or to some other totalitarian, I don't like this word, system. It is common to any political system or to any social organization. As anthropologists have shown time and again. It is common, for example, I'm speaking to you from Berkeley in California, where I'm based, and you know, the founding fathers of the American Constitution are the unquestionable. As you know, the Declaration of Independence even has a line: "We take these truths to be self-evident that all humans are created equal," and that the idea of equality, all humans are equal, is a very liberal interpretation of equality, very individual, and so forth. And that's taken to be an a priori truth, which is then, it's very difficult to question it and be a politician in the United States. So I'm just quickly illustrating to you what I mean by this core of the sovereignty. And so Lenin and Leninism stood for that. And Leninism was produced, as I show in my book and other chapters, and the things which are not connected to the one you read, Leninism as a body of texts, statements, a body of knowledge, was always re-edited and reshaped, and it was never quite the same through the whole Soviet history. And it was actually quite distinct from Lenin's own thoughts, which he always insisted have to be read in the particular context in which he wrote them. So Leninism, at the same time, it was always taken to be the foundational truth which cannot be questioned. No politician in the Soviet Union could question Leninism. It was impossible. Everything has to be started by claiming that you are starting from a Leninist position. That's the only way to legitimize whatever you do and whatever you say. And I can go into that in more detail if anyone is interested, but the point is that I then trace how this is linked to the production of this Leninist texts, but also to the creation of this body. The body was preserved somewhat unexpectedly. There was a lot of discussion, maybe we should not bury Lenin, because he was really associated with someone who started this completely radically new human history, the sort of ultimate human liberation, not only for Russia, but for the planet. And so, at least by the revolutionaries, that's how they thought about it. Not just the Bolsheviks, a much broader sway of of people, and I can show that historically. And so the idea was that we shouldn't really bury him like any other human being. There should be some kind of memorial site for the future generations. And the preservation of the body emerged out of that thinking, but it was not really planned ahead of time. There were all sorts of contingent conditions which enabled preservation. And once it was done, and once Vorobyov and Zbarsky, the two scientists and their assistants, declared 4 months after they started the project that if we maintain the body according to the method we just developed, it may stay in this condition for a very long time. And they didn't say for how long, but it was understood that for decades. After that, it was very difficult to actually turn back and say, okay, now we will bury it. So that's how it emerged. And again, there are many, many, many parts of the story here, which I trace, but I can go into that. Now, the paper which you read, that's the general context, right? Lenin died for those who don't remember, in January 1924, after a very severe illness, which lasted for almost 2 years. And I have a whole chapter about that as well. The illness is very important for understanding of preservation and how Lenin was already doubled into this Lenin and the actual person and Leninism, which kind of exceeds that person and even differs from him. He was not even allowed in 1923 in the beginning to edit some of his own texts because the Central Committee owned them. So there was this strange doubling. But anyway, so the paper which you read, Communist Proteins, I was working on the other bodies, which the same lab in Moscow also preserved. There were 10 altogether. In addition to the anonymous experimental bodies, which are preserved in the lab for research and experimental work. And I can go into that if you want. But among the famous bodies, which are not only preserved, but also displayed publicly, or were displayed publicly, there are 10. All done by the same scientists, all done more or less according to the same techniques. I say more or less because with time, the project evolved and developed further. And if, for example, Ho Chi Minh died in 1969, his body was preserved according to much more developed methods than Lenin's body. So there was also this dynamic of evolving project, but more or less a similar technique. And so it was important for me to trace those other bodies, not only for historical reasons that there are other bodies, and I have to explain how they're connected to Leninism as well, because they're not necessarily Leninist bodies. They can be Agostinho Neto, the president of Angola, was a socialist, and he was not a Leninist at all. But nevertheless, so I explained that. And the other reason for me to explore them was that I could get to Lenin's body through those other bodies and can figure out some parts of the scientific project by looking, for example, at the Bulgarian lab in Sofia, which preserved, where the Soviets worked together with Bulgarians, which maintained Dimitrov's body. And that's when I stumbled upon materials which I use in this paper. So my other interest, I should say, now retrospectively reconstructing my own trajectory towards this paper, my other interest is in biology, the origins of life, the search for life in the other parts of the universe. And it's a hobby which I really like. And I will probably, after this book is finished, I will switch to another book project, which will be about SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Life. It's not connected to Lenin in any direct way, but as you see here, it's also not disconnected. So, and I started researching the Bulgarian scientists, and I also, one of my key as an anthropologist say, somewhat problematic maybe term, my key informants in Moscow is or was Professor Yuri Lopukhin. He died recently, unfortunately. Yuri Mikhailovich Lopukhin, a famous anatomist and surgeon. And he worked in the Sofia laboratory in Bulgaria on Dimitrov's body many times and stayed there for months and even once for a couple of years. And he told me about his work with Georgy Nikolov, the scientist who is key scientist in this paper, the Bulgarian one. When they were young in the 50s, they talked a lot about its origins of life and other things. And a lot of the research, one thing I forgot to say, that the lab in Moscow, after the war, became an institute, which at its peak in the 60s had 200 people working in it. And the reason for that is that Lenin's body was more and more sort of distanced from the pure ideological symbol. And it was sort of maintained by inertia in some way. And a whole scientific project emerged around it, which in its peak in the 60s, 70s, and 80s enabled a kind of research conducted by scientists, which was not necessarily limited to maintenance of the body. Was research on aging, research on the transformation of non-living matter over a very long period of time. There was no, almost never a possibility of studying the processes of death or non-death over a long period of time before that. So now there was a very good sort of object for that kind of study. And I should also add that all the key scientists in both Moscow and Sofia labs worked there part-time. They were not only involved in maintenance of the body, like Lopukhin, who I spoke with. He went to this lab 3 times a week for years. But other than that, or sometimes twice a week even, other than that, he was a key scientist in the Institute of Physical Chemistry. He was a rector of the Second Medical Institute in Moscow. He was a very important figure in the developing of the Soviet system of kidney transplantation, the creation of cholesterol tests, non-invasive methods, and so forth. So all of these scientists were well-known experts in other areas, and their work in the lab, which maintained Lenin's body, often intersected with their own interests and cross-pollinated each other. So certain things became possible for them because the lab or the mausoleum lab enabled some experimental work, led to some thinking. And this is exactly what happened here in Sofia. The study of the protein and macroprotein structures in the skin allowed for the scientists who were already interested in the origins of life to think about proteins as this foundational environment within which this emergence of life could happen. And I'm tracing here the thought of Aparin and John Haldale. If you read the paper, you know, and so forth. So that's what how this paper emerged, kind of slightly sideways to the book, but it will be part of the book because I also trace a lot of other projects which became possible because of the scientists' involvement with the mausoleum lab, but which cannot be just limited to the body itself. And I guess another interest was to show how this dialectical materialist thinking was very central of the revolutionary period, and later was very central to thinking about the theories of emergence, going from Engels, something which is really downplayed in the history of science in the West because of the Cold War, and how systems theory in the West and cybernetics is linked also to that history, and also that link is downplayed. Okay, maybe I'll spoke too much, but that's basically contextualizing this project.
Thank you so much, Alexei. So now, like, so it's meant to be a discussion from now. So everybody if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to jump in and ask questions. Maybe we can know a little bit more about, because you mentioned Leninism, but this is the reference you make and that you stress in this paper is not about Leninism. It's more about it's really about you really talk about angles, and you go back to angles and say basically that he had an enormous influence on the Western science of the time. You talk about Handel, and well, I didn't know about that. Okay, can Nika, can you help me with that?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, that's a problem of being open and invite, allow everybody to come.
I see.
Sorry about this.
Yeah, it's okay. So Alexei, can we hear a little bit more about dialectical materialism and how this shaped the Western science and the science that emerged in Soviet Russia in Soviet Russia?
Yeah. So the book which I talk about in particular is Dialectics of Nature by Friedrich Engels. And the first time when can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, first time I just saw Vasily was kind of, I guess I'll look at the face. The first time Engels articulated that idea was in Anti-Düring, which is a famous book as well. And I should say that each time you refer to Engels in relation to that, that instantly creates a knee-jerk reaction, right, in many circles, because how can Marxist-Leninism be connected to something scientific? It's an answer, but that's not the case. I mean, so Anti-Düring, which was written only 19 years after Darwin, The Origin of Species, and then the Dialectics of Nature, which was not a finished book. It was edited after Engels' death and then published. And the first English translation and the first Russian translation were published in Russia because of the revolution, right? Engels was very influential because of the revolutionary moment. So in both of those books, following Marx as well, this idea of the materialism, dialectical materialism or materialist dialectic critiques the idealist dialectic of Düring or Feuerbach to argue that one cannot consider natural history and social history as separate entities. There needs to be an overarching theory which considers them together. And that's a way of Engels' building on Darwin, who spoke about, of course, biological evolution. And he already proposes there an idea that there needs to be a chemical or a material evolution which enables then the emergence of life and the biological evolution which follows, right? And he didn't really know very much 20th century biology. It was written in the 19th century, so some of his propositions were very basic, but he already then introduced the idea of the protein molecule potentially being a site where this emergence might happen. When Aparin read that work, and he actually didn't read the book because the book was published in Russian only a couple of years later, after Aparin's famous book, which is now all people who study the origins of life in the world know Aparin's work. He wrote The Origins of Life, Происхождение жизни, the Russian one, which is, if you read the paper, I have a picture there of this original book. He gave actually his talk in 1924, when exactly the year of Lenin's death, completely by chance. But he was introduced to the ideas of dialectical materialism through a lot of lectures in Moscow. He was a Muscovite at that time, which of course were possible because of the revolution and because of the influence of Engels and Marx. And so his idea of the chemical evolution, the idea of Aparin, which he outlined in that talk, and which became in the decades to come very influential and really shaped the whole field, came from that, from Engels. Well, he came to his realization, and then he developed it further as a scientist, as a biochemist. He was a biochemist based on that theory. Now, John Haldane in Cambridge, he read this work later in 1928 when he traveled to Moscow on the invitation of Vavilov, the Russian biologist and biochemist. And he was introduced to this work in English in the Russian translation. And then they published a version, a better translated version in England. And in the introduction to that work, he also wrote that if we knew that work earlier, then we would embrace the relativity theory in physics, for example, or this idea of biochemical and chemical evolution much earlier. So then he became really a convert, and a lot of his book, The Origins of Life, which he also wrote, not knowing Aparin's work, was also influenced by Engels. So the two founding figures, and now they are known as the Aparin-Haldane hypothesis, even though they didn't know each other until the 60s. I mean, they didn't meet until the 60s, and they didn't know each other in the 20s. They learned about each other's work subsequently. Nevertheless, the hypothesis has their joint name, Aparin-Haldane hypothesis, about this chemical evolution. And it's a commonplace theory now. And I'm showing also how it shaped the whole field, right, of the study of the origins of life. For Aparin, it was also very important to always maintain that one cannot think about life as in terms of a certain particles which are carriers of life, like so-called vitalist theories, some kind of biogene or other. There are many different names. Life is a certain synergistic process which happens when the system is integrated. It emerges as part of the systemic relations rather than it's a property of a concrete particle of matter. And that was also very important. And that came directly from dialectical materialism, the idea of the process and the idea of relations. And that's, of course, something which is very, very important for cybernetics as well, and for the systems theory later on, which developed in the late 30s and 40s in the West. And Haldane was also very crucial for that. Okay, so that's the connection to Engels.
Nika, please. Thank you very much, Alexei.
So I probably asking a stupid question, but it was like so difficult for me to read the paper. It's so stunning, and I want to ask about genetic and what was the reason for the for genetics being, what is the real reason for genetics being banned in Soviet Union, and how is it? Like if I understood you correctly, you're writing that genetics is a kind of taking this opposite approach now. So if you think everything is coded by our genes, this is the other side of vitalist that is equally restrictive and kind of.
No, genetics doesn't take the opposite view. I said there that you have several questions in one, so I'll start with the last one. Genetics. All I'm saying there, and I'm following some of the contemporary thinkers in this area, which I'm not myself doing research in, people like Terence Deacon, for example, that to reduce life, to explain life in terms of genetic code is reductive, right? Genetic code is a very important part of it, but the process itself, which is informed by genetics, the process itself is not just the code. The process itself is a synergistic form of relations, right? And that's something which is emergent and cannot be reduced to the information which genetic code provides. But without it, there will be no life, yeah. So it's not the opposite view, it's just that there's a lot of the reductive reading of genetics, right? The reason it was banned, or not quite banned, but really not encouraged in the Soviet Union, because there were still people doing genetic research even under Stalin. But genetics was definitely frowned upon. And the reason was because of this. I explained this in the paper. Maybe it's in the footnote. I'm not sure anymore, but maybe it's in the text. Because of this vulgar Marxism, which Stalin espoused and which the Soviet Union really embraced after the 30s. The idea that, you know, that this Marxist-Leninist version, which Stalin shaped and put forward, says that humans are completely malleable, that they can create their own conditions of their own change. They will direct their own evolution and of society, of the biological species. And genetics was seen from that position as being very bourgeois because it's very restrictive. It tells you what you have predispositions with and then downplays the social context, right? And for the same reason, Freudianism and Freud were rejected in the Soviet Union under Stalin. So it's not a problem of Marxism per se, it's a problem of this vulgar interpretation which Stalin espoused. As I say in the paper, there was an interesting turn to this events. Because genetics was not really encouraged, the research in genetics and publications in genetics were not encouraged. And Lysenko, who was this pseudoscientist basically, who was arguing that you can change the inherited traits of plants and of species and of living organisms within one generation, right? Epigenetics, actually some of the epigenetic research now goes back to this, but of course not to the full-fledged Lysenko ideas, but it doesn't reduce all of that thinking completely anymore. But anyway, so Lysenko was encouraged precisely because he seemed to Stalin to illustrate this Marxist-Leninist thesis, which Stalin shaped, that you can change nature very fast and at will, right? Which is why genetics was suppressed and Lysenko was celebrated. What was the other question? And I'm not saying that genetics is the opposite of Aparin's thinking. Aparin actually was very interesting, and Haldale was in fact one of the pioneers of genetic research. So Aparin hypothesis was very much informed eventually by the breakthroughs in genetics. But it doesn't really substitute for it. The idea of life as an emergent process, as an emergent quality, right? The idea of which in terms of Engels would be the transition from quantity to quality to the next stage, right? When systemic qualities of a system cannot be reduced to the sum of the qualities of its parts, right? There is a certain systemic quality which emerges out of the relations, right? And that's exactly how life emerged, right? It emerged at the level of this synergistic relations. And Aparin has this metaphor, which I think I quote in the paper, if I don't remember. But he talks about the fact that life is a process which is not just reproduction of the same form using the same elements, but it's reproduction of the same form with new elements coming into it all the time to reproduce the same form. And he gives this somewhat simple metaphor of a waterfall. The waterfall stays the same, but the new elements flow through it all the time. Yeah, so this processual aspect of it is very key for him. So genetic code enables that shape, but it's not the only thing which enables the flow, right? There's something else going on.
We have a couple of questions. Simona, did you raise your hand? Because if so, you were first.
I changed my mind.
You changed your mind, okay.
So since I'm there, are there connections? What do you say about Engels and dialectical? Is the right version of dialectical materialism reminds me very much of system theories. Is there a relationship between the two?
Yeah. I already mentioned this now in my answer, but if you read the paper, I actually go into that in detail. Maybe not as much as I could have, because it's not exactly the central theme, but yes, there is a connection. Systems theory, which was developed in the late 30s in Austria first, right? And then became dominant new way of thinking this in the West, and that eventually led to cybernetics as well, was very much shaped by the same thinking. And it followed the Aparian and Haldane breakthrough by like 20 years. So it's a whole number of years later. But the interesting thing is that as historian of science, Lawrence Graham, the one at MIT, writes, and many others as well write about this. The one reason why systems theory and cybernetics were so quickly embraced in the socialist bloc, in the Soviet Union in the early 60s, in the Eastern European countries, and so many young people were, and young engineers were into that theory, was that it made perfect sense, because the dialectical materialism, which was a dominant philosophical doctrine, and often dialectical materialism, which was practiced in the philosophy departments in the Soviet Union, was not the Stalinist one, but exactly the kind of oppositional one. There were people, the alternative Marxists, who wanted to follow Marx and not the reductive version which Stalin proposed. So the reason systems theory made perfect sense is that it was really compatible with the way they thought systemically already. I hope I answered your question. But as I said in the paper, I actually go into this.
We're going to take Michael's question. Michael?
You just, you said that, I was going to comment on the invention of the word transhumanism. I can't remember whether that was Oparin or Haldane.
Haldane.
It was neither Oparin nor Haldane. I think it was Julian Huxley.
Oh,
but,
okay, Huxley, right.
Haldane was clone.
Was clone. So to what extent is, do you see that kind of, because obviously transhumanism can be you know, this kind of prevalent shadow that hides behind science, and it's quite, you know, the will live forever and the thing, and the version that we have now is very much fueled by Silicon Valley kind of California ideology, and it's, you know, it's extremely sort of like anti-life. Do you see those kind of connections with those early ideas and some of the transhumanism that we have now? What do you see the role of? I mean, obviously, humanism was kind of an assault on the idea that you know, humans, people, you know, can make their own life. That, you know, so the religious ethic was quite repressive, right? So humanism has these advantages, but humanism is also very well coded into religion in terms of, like, so that, you know, in the Bible or the Torah, many of the, particularly monotheistic religions, come and say, look, humans have the right to control life and stuff. And so people would have both a critique of a, you know, some type of religious greater than the human, but also a critique of the idea that humans are, you know, control other forms of life and don't have to, and are somehow special before that. Mm-hmm. And sort of transhumanism has really kind of failed to really look at any kind of, it doesn't, you know, from a perspective of a museum for care, transhumanism doesn't have much care. So I wonder what you think about the invention of these, where that fit with dialectical materialism and science in general.
Well, first of all, thank you for this wonderful question. And I will really take issue about transhumanism, because you are talking about Silicon Valley transhumanism. There's a huge line of thought in contemporary Russia on transhumanism. And there's a wonderful book which came out last year, which I'm putting in the chat, by Anya Bernstein, the anthropologist, a good friend of mine, The Future of Immortality, where she traces Russian transhumanism today and historically. And it's completely different. It's very much, it's a social endeavor. It's not this neoliberal Silicon Valley, cryogenics, I will live forever kind of thing. It's very different. And she actually compares them. And the genealogy is different, and the values and social morality behind it is quite different. And it's a fantastic form of research. There are different groups. There's also a cryogenic lab in Moscow, which also freezes people together with their mothers and fathers and even pets. But nevertheless, the whole philosophy behind transhumanism in the Russian context, which emerges out of the Soviet and revolutionary one and continues today, is quite different. So what you said is very interesting, and I agree with you that this neoliberal kind of reduction of it, which it has no care, as you said, right? It's basically about bungee jumping in the future. When I die, I will survive and do it again. Most of them don't have, anyway, I won't go into that. It's quite different. But now going back to the question of how it connects to what I'm writing about here, people like Oparin and Haldane were very much, because they grew out of this revolutionary context, and Haldane was a communist. So two key figures in the origins of life field who are considered to be like the founding figures, they were both communists. One was a British communist, a very different type. One was who left the British Communist Party because it became too Stalinist. And one was a Soviet communist. And they were both, and Aparin was also anti-Stalinist. So both of them were very much impressed by the revolutionary project and the idea that, you know, humanity will, including on the scientific level, will be able to shape its own evolution, which we already see around us all over the place, and which clearly will be the case, right? Creating the conditions within which the biological evolution will be changed. Shaped.
Why do you think that's a clear future? It looks to me like humanity's on its way out. It's pretty much and taking many of the other organisms in life on the planet with it. I mean, the idea of living forever is very much like is a little bit like a cancer cell. It's, if you have one cell in the body that says, "Oh, me, I'm going to live more," where do you? I mean, what? I mean,
I encourage you to read this book by Anya, The Future of Immortality. No, I'm not going to argue whether the humanity is on the way out or on the way in. Maybe it's not on the way out. Maybe it is.
Some oppositions, but
no, I agree with you. There's a lot of risks, and there's a lot of completely unethical sort of relationships to nature and to the animal world and to our own environment. I know. I think we still have a hope, and I think not all transhumanism is part of that kind of relationship to nature. Again, I encourage you to read this other book. But the way they thought about it, right, was very much within the ethics of care and within the ethics of this socialist revolutionary values, right? Which, I mean, we know Stalin betrayed completely, but they were into them and they were committed to them in the 20s, and a lot of their thinking grew out of that commitment. Thank you.
Hello, Kenneth. Welcome. We're listening to you.
Hi. Thanks, Vasily, and thank you, Alexei. I have a question about the life worlds of the scientists you were studying and were working with. Now, like within the context of the past decade, 2 decades, are the scientists within the Lenin Institute Leninists? Do they see themselves as dialectical materialists of any sort? What does dialectical materialism mean for them? And I would like to ask the same question as well about now that genetic reductionism is being critiqued internally within the scientific discourse. Are the critics of genetic reductionist vitalist explanations, do they see themselves as dialectical materialists? Do they read dialectical materialism? What place does it have within their worldviews and their scientific practice? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you asked the question in the present, and of course we should start by saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and even the decades before the collapse, from late 1950s onwards, were marked by a very broad withdrawal from the Marxist discourse by the scientists. So I don't think they would say we are dialectical materialists. I think, nevertheless, a lot of the systems thinking and a lot of the thinking, for example, in the theories of emergence, has been shaped by this kind of approach. So people like Haldane and people like Oparin shaped a lot of the research, having themselves been influenced by dialectical materialism. It doesn't mean that scientists see themselves as Leninists. And the word Leninist, by the way, is a very different term. It's a term introduced already by the Stalinist version of Marxism, right? Lenin himself didn't like that term. It was introduced in the last year of Lenin's life, and he was totally adamantly against it. I'm not trying to justify Lenin here. I'm just saying how that history emerged. So Leninism was a term invented for a very reductionist project. And Marxism-Leninism, which is basically Leninism, is not the same as Marxism in the West, or Marxism of the scientists originally. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, this lab has really shrunk. There's not very much research going on. I'm writing here about some research they're doing, very in-depth research, which is not limited to the project of preserving the body. But now the lab is really a practical little institution which maintains the body in the same state and does no research. And it's very small now. It's practically not funded by the state. It's privately funded now. So if Lenin's body is no longer preserved and displayed eventually, it still is displayed. But if it's not, most likely it will not be, because there will be some political decision with a big fanfare kind of project of taking him out, but probably just because there will be no scientists left to maintain it, because it's very difficult for them to educate new scientists. No one wants to work there because it's not prestigious and so forth. So today, it's not connected to that kind of philosophical thinking at all. But even then, people like Lopukhin and Nikolov, who I write about in this paper, they are not necessarily committed communists themselves. The fact that they are thinking in terms of this dialectical materialist view about the origins and the nature of life doesn't make them Leninists and communists. It makes them someone who is informed by the philosophy of nature. And the philosophy of nature in the Soviet case is rooted into this ideas of Marx and Engels, as well as a lot of other things. They were influenced also by systems theory, by genetics and so forth. So it doesn't make them, and I make a point there, that it doesn't make them into this people who are paying lip service to a certain kind of discourse because the party requires it. They might do that as well, but that's not the point. Their own thinking as scientists is not dogmatic and ideological, right? So that's why the question of whether they see themselves Leninists or not, for them would be kind of, no, we're not. That's not the point. Because that requires adherence to a certain party ideology, which they secretly would feel, or privately would feel, is too reductive, too simplistic, too repetitive, and not to do with science. Mm-hmm. But thank you, Candace. I forgot to thank you for the question.
Do we have any other question? By the way, if you're non-academic, you can also ask questions. It's a debate open to everyone. You're making a point at some point at the beginning of the paper, Alexei, about the sensory nature of the skin, where you say the haptic nature of the skin. And I wanted to ask you on that, on the controversial and complex relationship between Relics and Lenin's body.
Okay, so the question is how they.
Oh yeah, because I didn't explain myself really like properly, because relics in the Middle Age. There were things coming from bodies of saints, and they were keeping some sacrality, and you can basically get a little bit of that. Sometimes it was curative if you touch them, and obviously I don't know. I don't think you can touch Lenin's body. Obviously, it's in a glass sarcophagus. So how does that work?
Yeah.
You know, this relationship between the relics and Lenin's body, knowing that Lenin was really anti-religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're really interested in this question, I have a whole chapter devoted to this in this upcoming book, a little advertisement, where I compare Lenin's body with relics and show how it's profoundly different. But of course, the concept of sacrality shouldn't be reduced to only saints and only religion. It's a sacred body, but not in the religious sense. And sacredness is a very expansive category, which should be liberated from the shackles of religion, right? The way we often read about it in popular media. There's also a lot of work written about Lenin's body, which says, oh, this body was preserved to create a relic for the ignorant population because they were familiar with relics of saints. And I'm showing that this is completely wrong. This kind of historicism, which creates this causal relations because something looks alike without studying it, it's very problematic. And it's also the echo of the Cold War in history, as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to name any names, but there's a lot of that literature. So there are several things which you can say about the relationship of this body to relics. Thing number one, relics in Christianity, and not only in Christianity, also in Buddhism and in many other religions. But in Christianity, relics exist in Catholicism and in Orthodoxy, not in Protestantism. So they are bodies of saints, right, which are preserved somehow miraculously. The defining feature of a body like that is that it is preserved, or the claim is that it is preserved without any interference by humans. It's preserved on its own through the divine interference, right? It's called incorruptible body. In practice, of course, what it means is that the body is really not necessarily preserved in a very good state. There are many bodies, and I go into some of them in detail. They are dried up. They are often it's just like in the case of the Orthodox relics, it's just bones, maybe with a little bit of skin, maybe with no skin, right? Sergius Radonesky's, the famous relic, the famous saint's body, it's just bones. So they are preserved without any interference, and they are preserved in such a way that they are not recognizable as the original body. They're dried up, darkened. Often they lose any kind of similarity to the original, right? Any kind of, especially facial similarity. And that's not the problem. The problem is that they are carriers of a certain sacred energy. With Lenin's body, it's the opposite on both counts. First of all, it is preserved to remain as the body of Lenin at the moment of death. It's flexible. I go into that a little bit in this paper, but much more in the other paper. Maybe I can put it in the, it's called Bodies of Lenin. I have a paper which talks about this body at length and also compares it a little bit with relics. Oh yeah, actually I have a body which just is devoted to the comparison of Lenin and relics. If you're interested, Vasily, I'll send you a link. Anyway, so first of all, it is preserved to maintain the exact parameters of the body as it was at the moment of death. And even better, in some ways it's even improved because Lenin, anyway, I won't go into it. That's one, which makes it different from the relics. And the second and the most important thing is that it is preserved through science, through constant interference, never-ending interference, almost daily. And that is a well-known fact, and it was always stressed by the revolutionaries in the media, in the 20s especially. They were saying this body is preserved by science. It's a great achievement of Soviet science and so forth. So it was done in order to dispel any connection to relics. And they also started a campaign at the same time when they would send Bolshevik scientists to the sites, the monasteries, some churches where religious saints' bodies were known to be contained. And they would do experiments with those bodies and publish them to show how these bodies are not really somehow miraculously preserved, that they are just corpses and there's nothing special about them. Or sometimes they would show that actually the monks secretly embalmed them and claimed that they didn't. So again, these are not miraculous, and so forth. So these two campaigns were designed to show that Lenin's body has nothing to do with relics. They were really careful about it. They were always worried that some people might interpret that as a relic. So I think that is an important thing. You can still say, so what, some people will still see it as a relic, and probably that was the case. And in fact, I cite some examples of that interpretation. But for the people who preserved the body and who thought that it was important, it was really key that they made every effort to disconnect the two and to show how it's different.
Thank you very much. Colleen, we're listening to you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated your talk, and your paper was fantastic. I really loved the play with liminality, and investigating the skin, and the barrier of the skin is fantastic. I'm a Berkeley PhD in archaeology, though, and I am very interested in the digital afterlives of these things, and the digital dead. And so I just wanted you to speculate, as you kind of dip into transhumanism and things like that, I know, very different form of such. What is the future of Lenin's body? And do you see any digital echoes around Lenin's body?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, first of all, good to see someone from the same department, even from the other side. We have two houses in the department, archaeology and sociocultural anthropology. It's almost like two departments under one roof. But and also I didn't expect, but I will advertise again Anya Bernstein's book, The Future of Immortality, because one chapter is devoted to the digital transhumanism, which is also very big in Russia. So you would be probably interested in that. Actually, two chapters, one in particular, but two different versions of digital transhumanism, which is very interesting. In terms of, oh, by the way, I will start by answering the question which I didn't answer with Vasily, which connects it to Colleen's question about the skin. And then I will talk about digital. With the skin, it's very interesting. The skin of Lenin, like I already mentioned a little bit in this paper, but much more in the paper which I posted in the chat, Bodies of Lenin, in that paper, in the journal. I don't remember where I published it, but anyway. In representations. So in that paper, I show how the body of Lenin is really missing a lot of organs, especially internal organs. And of course, the brain is taken out. All those so-called wet organs, which cannot really be preserved well, and they will decompose. And it also has a lot of prosthetic things here and there, not too many, but here and there, some plastics attached, some artificial eyes, certain artificial bones, because they become, because of the very aggressive embalming environment, they eventually become very brittle, and some bones had to be built up, so to speak. But there's one organ which cannot be substituted and changed, or they really have problem doing that, and that's the skin. They really need to preserve their authentic skin. How that condition developed, it's never really articulated in any paper or instruction which says you cannot, but it became something well understood by all the scientists and by all the commissions of the party which was sent to check the body. Because if you change the skin, if you start supplementing it with artificial skin more and more and more, and eventually it becomes just covered with artificial skin, it stops being a body, it becomes an effigy. And so that's why the skin was so important, and all these protein macromolecules are studied to such an extent, and they really try to understand how the skin can be preserved in the dead body and be not the skin which we use for our clothes, but like real skin. It's very soft, it's very lifelike, they had to develop a lot of methods for that. And that's why they did so much research into proteins. And that's why the thinking about proteins was enabled by that research, which was so profound. So I'll go into that research at length in the book. But so that's about the skin, right? That because of the particular nature of the skin in the structure of our identity, in the structure of the identity of the individual, right? And the skin is this encounter with the other, and all the other things I write about the skin, this tactile visual thing, you cannot really replace it. You have to maintain it for the body to be authentic, even though it's missing internal organs, and that doesn't make it inauthentic. But the skin would make it inauthentic if it's replaced. So that's the question about the skin. And again, it didn't develop because someone sat down and wrote an instruction. It developed with an understanding eventually, sort of emerged. And research around it also emerged and took a life of its own and went in other directions which are not limited to the body. Now, in terms of the digital, I think one interesting thing about Lenin's body is if you look at the monuments to Lenin, which were produced in the 1920s, in the 30s, all of them were produced, and there was an instruction about it, and it was like a very well-developed system, produced with the help of the death mask. The death mask, which was first cast by Merkurov, Sergei Merkurov, who was a sculptor asked to do that, was then multiplied, not too many times, and every sculptor who was allowed to make a sculpture, then all the other sculptures were taken down. At first there were many spontaneously emerging, and then they took that whole circulation of the sculpted images under control, took down the ones which are not approved, and peppered the whole country with the approved ones, and they were connected to the death mask and ultimately to the body itself. So there was this tactile link between the body and every image, which both visual and sculptural. Visual through a number of photographs, there was a very limited number of approved photographs, and a photograph can be thought of as the death mask as well. Again, I go into that in the book, again, a little advertisement for the book. There's a whole chapter about the images. So with the digital world, I think you can think about that kind of perpetuation. But of course, Lenin stopped playing the role, which is linked to the sovereign center of power, right? With the collapse of the Soviet system, it became simply a historical object. Which also made it into a scientific object for scientists, much more than before. So I don't think that the digital afterlife of Lenin today would play any role beyond kind of the artistic involvement, because there's practically no, even the Communist Party, which is not really a communist party, but it's a nationalist party in Russia. It's called itself communist, but it's not really communist, who go and do these rituals on Lenin's birthday and lay flowers to the mausoleum. They don't really engage with Lenin's ideas. They're completely opposite to Lenin's ideas. So I don't really see the afterlife having the same momentum as it had in the Soviet times. Although, who knows, there might be a revival elsewhere, right? Because we now see so many publications on Lenin Revisited. I have some of them here. I've been reading them for one chapter as well, by different philosophers all over the world. So there might be. So one can think about this digital afterlife in relation to that kind of revival. I don't know. But again, to make a step back for a second, because I was thinking about the body here more than about Lenin's ideas themselves. There's a connection, but not a direct one, as I showed. I don't really quite see how this digital transhuman afterlife of this body would make any sense. Maybe you can suggest to me. I don't see that.
Well, I think you were talking a little bit about, as you're going into Deleuzian concepts, I liked that you harkened back to the analog repetitions and sort of a Walter Benjamin kind of thing, but and thinking about he has become his own representation, which you state in the paper. but then you can think about him as a repetition with it through the death masks that then culminate into representation. It's very fascinating in many levels. I can see why you've written an entire book about it. But I'm just thinking of deep fakes, and I'm thinking of you know, reanimating people through digital means and that sort of thing, and that we can make Lenin sing and dance and play. And so that's the kind of resurrection that I'm thinking of.
Now I understand, and in fact, I take back that I don't see it. I actually write about this right now, and I didn't think about it in the terms of your question. Let me just backtrack a little bit. Let's go back to the point which I was making about the death mask, that this proliferation of the images which had to connect back to the body. It's good that you brought up Benjamin, because on the surface it might seem from the first glance, and I think erroneously, that this is like the famous you know, mass copying and mass reproduction through which the aura is lost. But I think eventually that's what happens in late socialism. Lenin's monuments are not really representing Lenin anymore. They become this really something else. And that also answers the question of why many countries toppled them. They didn't topple Lenin, they toppled something else. But in the 20s and 30s, there's a big attempt to create this cloning of images rather than copying. You know, W.T.J. Mitchell, the art historian in Chicago, he wrote about cloning images. And the thing about cloning, they are organically linked to the original, right? So that's exactly what they're trying to do. Well, I mean, that's how they imagine it, right? Their organic connection, and which is exactly the attempt not to let the aura die out, to have every monument be an extension of the body itself, right? And that is very interesting. This is exactly what they're trying to do with the photographs and death masks. And eventually they fail. I saw your skeptical smile, and this is exactly what happens in late socialism. Reproducing Lenin became such an automatic thing that many artists who are interviewed, they can draw Lenin in the 50s and 60s with their eyes closed. They just know it by heart. And this is a very good way for them to make money, because there's always funding for this. There's always a need for more Lenin images for different clubs and schools and so forth. And everyone is doing the same ones and no one pays any attention to it. So of course the aura is gone. So, but the original idea of cloning was to cover the whole surface of the country with that extension, right? Now, how it's connected to the digital, it's very interesting because, but I'm thinking about it slightly differently from how you just proposed, I think, or maybe not. You know, this term NFT, does anyone know what NFT is? Non-fungible token. This is a new thing in digital art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the idea is precisely when you have a digital art object, an artwork, online, for example, how do you create an original and sell an original, and anyone can copy it and it's identical file? And so now they're developing that system that an original file, digital file, has an embedded code called NFT, non-fungible token, non-manipulable token, fungible. And that NFT can always be demonstrated through a certain program, and any copy of that original will not have it. So that hidden secret encoded little worm inside makes the original, right? And that's an interesting concept, how digital art can continue with the idea of authenticity. And the thing is that with the death mask, this is exactly what they're trying to do, right? The pre-digital NFT is exactly the attempt. That's how they're imagining it in the 20s and 30s, that they will create these images which are directly linked to the original. They are marked by this code, which is that they are created through the death mask, through direct imprint, right? Another example of that is the Orthodox icons in Eastern Christianity. You know, all the schisms between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, the accusations of idolatry. But in Eastern Christianity, to this day, an icon is not a representation, an external representation of the saint's body, but something which is created through an imprint, a direct death, well, like a death mask, right? And so when you kiss the icon, you're not committing idolatry. You're not mistaking the icon for the saint, but rather you're interacting with something on the other side, so to speak. It's like a membrane, a meeting point. And that's also connected to NFT. NFT today in the digital art is a similar kind of concept, an attempt to reproduce, to embed authenticity in a place where it seems to be absent. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Yes, I rather comment and not a question. First of all, about relics. I would not say it's not connected, Lenin's body and relics. I would rather say that the difference between them is that the power of relics comes from God, and the preservation of Lenin's body comes from science. And this is very connected with the idea of preserving this body that is about the attempt to keep Leninism untouched and to eternalize his ideas as science, as the truth, the scientific truth about humanity. And so the difference is that Lenin's body is a symbol of an eternal truth embodied, while relics are a sort of a symbol of delegated power from God. And in a sense, I think they did to Lenin's body what they did to communism. They tried to make it something untouched that will never change, because this is already the truth, and this leads to the hypersimplification of Stalinism then, because we had an interesting discussion in the mailing list about corpse and what does it mean to keep somebody's corpse untouched, and to keep it stay, to immobilize it. It is the real death of Lenin and of communism in a way.
Yeah, I would also not say that Lenin's body. Are you there? Yeah, I thank you, Simona, for the question. That's wonderful. I would also not say that Lenin's body is not at all like relics. What I would say is that the concept of sacrality, of sacredness, I prefer sacredness, doesn't have to be understood in religious terms. It's a much bigger concept, and it's connected to the idea of sovereign power, right? And of course, the sovereign power of God is one example, but there are many different versions of that, right? We have a lot of different philosophers writing about it. One of them is Agamben recently, which I find somewhat limiting, but I'm going into that in this chapter about the sacred. Lenin's body was sacred, but it was sacred not in the same way as the relic, right? It was sacred as the unquestionable. It was really the embodiment of that questionable truth, as you said. And that's a problem with this approach to the communist project, right? It's a very particular Leninist approach, or Stalinist, you can say. When something is then questionable, then it is considered to be the objective truth, which is beyond any kind of debate, right? But the interesting thing about the sacred and the relationship to sovereignty is that as such, Leninism became the expression of the unquestionable truth. But as someone wrote, I think Anika wrote in the chart, they constantly changed the body. Yes, they constantly changed the body, and they constantly changed Leninist texts. If you compare even if you just compare the 5 collected, the big collections of Lenin's works, the full collections of Lenin's works with multiple volumes, and each of them, there are 5 in the whole of Soviet history until the 70s, and they're all different. And if you can compare some texts and what's included, what's not, what names are taken out of different letters and telegrams, what apparatus of footnotes and bibliography are provided, they're all different. So Leninism as a body of texts and knowledge is constantly shaped and reshaped. And the same happens with the body in the mausoleum. It's constantly reshaped to be the same, right? It's the same, but it's also constantly evolving. And the idea here is that, of course, it's a kind of a paradoxical body and paradoxical discourse, Leninism. And Lenin's body is paradoxical because it is to remain the same and remain unquestionable, the unquestionable truth from which everything starts. It has to constantly be edited and re-edited. And there are constant campaigns in Soviet history of trying to go back to the real Lenin, of trying to overcome the distortions of Stalin, the distortions of Khrushchev, and then the distortions of everyone under Gorbachev. And once all distortions have been overcome and everything is published, the whole thing collapses in the end. So Lenin is actually key to the whole Soviet history of this Lenin which they constructed. And when Lenin finally flip-flops in 1990, and Vasily, I think, mentioned, or maybe Dmitry mentioned my paper about Lenin the mushroom, this kind of jokes are possible in the media. There's no foundational truth to go back to anymore. That's when the system very quickly implodes. And that will be the last chapter. No, not the last one. The last one will be the Lenin apart in Ukraine and all the monuments. But thank you, Simona, you're absolutely right. Only I would say the truth of it is not coming from science. Science is mobilized for re-editing this body. But the truth comes from the idea that this voice is external to the political system. It comes from elsewhere. It's an objective voice of truth. Yeah. But again, I would stress that this doesn't make it religious. Or it depends what we mean by religion, right? There are so many writings about how communism was a political religion. I think it's completely missing the point. People should read Talal Asad, who wrote a lot about secularism and religion. You know, the anthropologist, Talal Asad, his writings are just excellent.
Yeah, I totally agree. So it makes me think of Judaism and on how the Jewish law has been continuously changed through Haggadah and Gemara, and just to try to keep it the same. The strive for adaptation of the law to the changing conditions of Jewish communities made it necessary to rely on comments. And well, this is interesting.
But I'm also wondering whether this is not the general condition, whether it's not just some religious or communist contexts. Take again the United States. I'm only talking about United States because I'm speaking out of United States right now. You know, the Constitution has been constantly interpreted to accept new and new we the people into the we the people, right? And the famous phrase with which it starts. And some of the things which are happening today actually run counter to the original framers. And I wonder what will happen in the future with a country like this. But it's always nevertheless taken as the unquestionable truth, the founding moment. But it's been reinterpreted. So I think it might be a more general, one of the elements of the political system and its historical evolvement is that it takes some foundational, not only political, social system in general, right? A certain foundational truth, but it has to evolve. And at some point, it will actually undo itself.
Yeah. Still on the anecdotal side, but if there's anybody who wants to speak, I'll be quiet. Okay, sorry.
Can I just say? Yeah, so
Yeah,
about
and also I'm a bit conscious of time. Alexei, how much longer can you stay with us? Can we take a couple more questions?
Oh, yeah. I expected it to be 2 hours, so there's no problem.
Okay, thank you very much.
It doesn't have to be, but I have 2 hours.
Okay.
Yeah, so I want to say about concept of sovereignty that we wrote this children book with David about kings, and the kings is also this concept of sovereignty, and David wrote about that in a dead book that
there you go.
Yeah, this is Marshall Salons. Yeah, like,
I actually used his other paper about the Shilluk kingdom, the one which was David Graeber's paper.
Yeah, so it's exactly what he was talking about, sovereignty. That was that David really shared that ideas that in Marshall Salons as well, that any society has this idea of something outside, and it's like in hunter-gatherer societies, it's also something like a sun or nature, something that bigger than every individuals, and it's just the oppressive societies when one person is becoming like Stalin, becoming the source of all everybody's else.
Stalin wasn't. That my argument is actually, sorry interrupting you, Nika.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Stalin never occupied the sovereign position in Russia, even in the Soviet Union, even though it might sound counterintuitive, because we know of the cult of personality, we knew of the complete centrality of his power. Stalin could develop a cult of personality and such total power over everything only by constantly referring to Leninism, by positioning himself as the best interpreter of Leninism, by always introducing himself as the main disciple of Leninism. And when Stalin, I mean, it's a big enigma, right? That in 1953, Stalin dies, and 2 years later, he's accused of crimes. He's accused of the cult of personality. There's a big rehabilitation of a lot of people. Stalin's monuments are taken down. He's a criminal. And that doesn't spell the end of Soviet Union or the collapse of the party, because there's always a claim that we're going back to Lenin, whom Stalin distorted. So the only figure which occupied the sovereign position was the figure of Leninism. And Stalin used his connection to that figure to usurp power. And that's the difference, right, between the sovereignty and the ruler. The ruler doesn't necessarily have to be there. It's different in the Nazi system with the Führer principle, because Hitler really embodied the position of the Nazi truth. There was no ideologue, the voice of Nazism, which predated Hitler, to whom Hitler referred as the main voice. Hitler was himself. And so with that kind of system, it's very difficult to continue with the death of the leader. And that, of course, we don't know because they lost the war. But with Leninism, you could continue, reinvent the Soviet system each time by claiming that now, finally, we're going back to real Lenin.
So Lenin was more like a son than, like a king. So I mean, built
or
around
any other number of voices of the sovereign truth. Yeah.
like American
In
Constitution.
absolutist monarchy, it's the king. But in absolutist monarchy, it's the king who is temporarily occupying that position. You know, in this other paper, The Bodies of Lenin, I write about absolutist monarchies and the figure of the doubled body, right? Every king has a mortal body and an immortal body. The king dies, and the immortal body is then re-inhabits the body of the next king. And that's the dynasty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that body is consubstantial with sovereignty. And each king temporarily occupies that position and then leaves. Michael, I think, has a question.
Yeah, just when you talked about the Constitution in America as sovereign, as they or this kind of story that goes back, I guess I get confused because I certainly know what you mean, but there's huge numbers of people, lots of young people who would kind of look at that and say, yeah, that's just kind of nonsense in the sense of it doesn't relate to me. You know, people go back and say, oh, well, this is documented so great. How come a black man is 3/5 of a person and a black woman is less because the women didn't even vote in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So, you know, these types of things. So when, and so you're also looking at Lenin as that kind of truth for people. How do I think about the relationship between Lenin as a sort of a truth of a particular system, or the Constitution as a truth of a particular system, and lots of us who kind of look at these systems and think, how could I get rid of them? Or when do I need to like kind of know these truths so I can deal with other people? Or even when do I need to know these truths so I can figure out whether they got into my head and actually I believe some of them because I just haven't thought about it. I guess I'm just trying to understand how you talk in terms of like regular people who don't, or if somebody came from another country, you know what I mean?
I understand.
The genius of the immigrant who just comes to the country and understands everything without even knowing the language. And they're like, normal people can't figure out who runs the country. And the immigrant comes and looks and up at the buildings, and out on the tops of the skyscrapers is written the names of banks, and they have a better theory of political economy than most people in the university.
Thank you. This is a good question. And I think this is why it's so important not to confuse the idea of the foundational truth and sovereignty with belief. It's not based on belief. The legitimacy of the system is not based on our belief in it. In America, a law can be overturned if it's deemed unconstitutional. It cannot be overturned if someone says, this is a wrong law. It doesn't make a difference if you say that. You can't say that. You have a liberal democracy. A lot of things are possible in public circulation. You can say those things, but they will not change the law until there is a demonstration that it's unconstitutional. So this is why the position of the Constitution is different from the position of our belief in certain things. And this is why I say foundational truth, not to say that we believe in that truth necessarily, but we take it as unquestionable. That's a different thing. Which is why political systems are not based on, and ideologies are not based on beliefs. They may involve belief or disbelief, but they're based on certain other forms of relationships, which is why the concept of sovereignty is so important. You don't even have to believe that the king is the king because God decided so. And yet there's no way to undermine that kind of relationship unless it is decided through revolution, through the change of the system, through the constitutional reform, or through the Supreme Court in America deciding that, for example, segregational laws, the Jim Crow in America is unconstitutional. They had to go through that decision on the level of Supreme Court and had to make a statement that this actually contradicts Constitution. So there's a constant reference to Constitution. And this is the only mechanism through which it is undone, which tells you the position it occupies. It occupies the position external to the political. It itself cannot be questioned. Or if it is questioned, the system will change. Of course, it one day will be questioned. So that's the point, which is why I think belief is an important thing, and we can be very cynical about it, but we cannot really change it unless we change the system completely, right? So the Constitution occupies a sovereign position. And Lenin occupied a similar position. There were many people, as I said, in the late Soviet period who didn't care what Leninism is. They never read it, and they didn't care. But they knew that it's unquestionable, and they lived with this idea. And they understood it, it's unquestionable, which is why they didn't expect the collapse. I think Dmitry said that I show in my book how people were not surprised by the collapse, but I actually show also how they didn't expect it. It was completely unexpected. And that's an important thing. It doesn't mean that they believed the system, but they believed that it's unchangeable.
If no one wants to ask question, may I ask about actually we have so much small amount of time left, so I do want to ask about extraterrestrial lives and why are you go there?
Why
would you write about that? How is it connected to this paper? Because you're already talking about you know, this in this paper that we read. And how are you going to develop it?
Thank you, Zina, for the kind words. Yeah, well, it's not really my interest in extraterrestrial or just in the universe and in the concept of life, which goes beyond just Earth, is not connected to this, is not coming out of that paper. I was very happy to stumble upon that connection. But I had that interest always. I wanted to be an astronomer when I was growing up. So seriously, and I was actually a physicist before I became an anthropologist. Yeah, I have a degree, and I was working in the lab for 3 years. And then I went to America on a student visa to become a member of the anthropology PhD program. But anyway, because whatever. Soviet Union collapsed, so everything changed. But the connection is that I'm interested in the kind of questions I think when I'm trying to answer this question, which I had the chance to do before. People ask me about this. I guess what I'm attracted to is some kind of systemic problems, which are like the problem of how is political system organized and how not to reduce, for example, this Soviet experience to some kind of authoritarian rule. There's much more to it than that, and much more to the revolution and the concept of communism. And it's a systemic thing which cannot be explained in terms of its internal rules. That's something which exceeds them always. And I think with the question about extraterrestrials, it's a similar thing. It's a certain systemic thing which is very important to think about life elsewhere. It's very important to understand life here, right? How it emerged out of what? What is biology? What's the relationship between biology and history? All those things. So I guess that's the connection for me. Yeah. I don't know how to explain it better than that, but I'm also interested in, I constantly listen to podcasts about extraterrestrial search for extraterrestrial life, because there's a lot of that, actually at Berkeley as well. In the astrophysics department, they have the SETI program, which is centered here, and in the SETI Institute in the Silicon Valley, next door. And I know all those folks. So I think this will be a good field site for me as well. I can actually talk. There's also a lot of that in Russia. That's another thing, another attraction for me, because I go to Russia all the time, and I remain a Russian citizen. So I do research in Russia a lot. And there's a lot of interest in the astrophysical and astrobiological community there in this international project. So it allows me to remain within the field of more or less Russian studies, but think about the universe.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Alexei?
I also want to ask very carefully about Troy Bashkar, because we wanted to read him in Museum of Care, and he was just one of the favorite philosophers of David. I don't know if you know, he's a philosopher of science, and it's, to me, who is not a philosopher and not an academic, when I read the article, it's very much correlated with Troy Bashkar, but I don't know if you.
Yeah, I know, but not enough to really comment. I should read more. I'm not familiar in depth. Yeah.
Yeah, then I would also say that Mitya proposed to read here a chapter from your book when it comes out. So just let us know.
Yeah. When is it going to be published, Alexei? Your next book?
Yeah, very, very painful question always. I haven't finished it yet. So after that, it goes through reviews and copy editing. I don't think it can possibly be published even a year from now. It will probably a little bit longer, but I'm hoping not too long. I was talking to my son the other day that in 2024, it will be 100 years, but I don't want to actually publish it for the 100th anniversary. It's too long. So hopefully it will come out in 2020, maybe late 2022. That's what I'm hoping.
Okay,
yeah.
No pressure, of course.
I mean, I wrote most of it, but I'm working now on the main chapter about the lab, and it's taken the life of it. It's also very big at the moment. It has to be, you know how it is, shrunk, but it's very painful to do that because everything is so important in it. You know how when you write, you don't want to let go. So, but you know, I wanted to thank everyone. If there's no questions, of course, if there are questions, I'm open to continue. But Michael, Simona, whoever I forget, Dmitry, very good questions. And thank you so much for letting me talk about that, because it always helps to formulate things. Yeah, and thank you, Nika, for inviting.
Yeah, generally we have reading groups for 1 hour, so that's very long class. But this was so fascinating, and yeah, I think we should continue with Roy Bashkar and wait for your book, and then we can read this recommended chapter about Lenin apart, or whatever you would recommend us.
If anyone is interested in understanding more how I'm approaching this paper, which I think I wrote the title of in the chat, called Bodies of Lenin, the hidden science of communist sovereignty is a subtitle. It's in Representations, the journal called Representations 2015. It explains in much greater depth the main point of the argument. And then there's also a couple other papers, but
and
you know.
Maybe we can also take it to our Museum of Care library if it's an open access papers, if you have rights to them, and we can put them in this museum room.
I actually have, of the site called academia.edu. People probably know. There's a site called academia.edu. And I put all my papers on free access there, just to let people read them without the wall, the people. And that's very important for me because in Russia, many of my colleagues don't have access to papers. So we agreed that we will all put them on academia. So whatever paper I have about Lenin is all there.
Okay.
You know how it works. You go to the site, you just put in the name of which you're searching for, and my page on that site will come up and all the papers are there.
Yeah, I will put it on the page of the reading group, your page in academia.
Great.
And So thank you so much for coming. It was great.
Thank you very
Book is
much.
coming out whenever you have time.
Thank you. It was inspiring.
Thank you so much. Where are you
Bye-bye.
located?
Sorry, I'm in Italy, Bologna.
Bologna. Okay. It's funny. I don't really know who's where.
Yeah, I think Mark is in, so we are spread it around everywhere. Okay, so bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much, Alexei. Thank you.
Bye-bye.